Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. In this episode, we're going to look at the Trump Witkoff Dmitriev debacle that's been unfolding and perhaps put our own Silicon Curtain spin on it. Before we jump into that story, thanks to everyone who supports the channel. Your support is absolutely fabulous and, of course, invaluable this year as we wind up towards the end of the year and we're doing various events and interviews, especially here on the ground, as some of you know, and I look forward to being able to share those with you. So thank you to everyone who's gone to Patreon, buy me a coffee. It is a tremendous help. Let's get into the story. The man sent to sell peace in Russia's war against Ukraine turns out to have been helping the competition polish their sales pitch. He's gone from witless and hapless amateur diplomat to become Witkoff, the Kremlin whisperer. On the surface, this appears to be a treasonous act, but it seems that Trump doesn't really care one way or another. It's at this point we must ask some important questions and start to draw some conclusions. Putin's envoy, for starters, would hardly go to all this trouble behind the scenes to plant the idea of the 28 points in the minds of the US administration if Trump was simply an agent of the Kremlin. Surely they could snap their fingers and he'd get it done for them. They wouldn't have to go through all of this rigmarole. It suggests that the Kremlin does not control Trump. And perhaps they also find his actions as wayward, capricious, and sometimes unpredictable as we do. This episode also gives an insight into many of the Trump side of the equation. They may not be assets or agents, but they are quite happy to align with the Kremlin on certain points and are not at all deterred when this comes to light. We must conclude that they just don't care. Get peace done is something apparently that Trump wants, but he does not care how. The detail of how, values, morality, sensitivity, justice, these are all so much white noise to him. And finally, we must conclude something obvious and yet overlooked, that Putin wants to make peace directly with the US, completely excluding the Europeans and the British, and preferably with Ukraine as a bit player with no visible agency in the process. Well, in this bit, we're diving into the leaked calls between Trump's envoy, special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and top Putin aides, Yuri Ushakov and Kirill Dmitriev. The regime's sanctions-busting money man. We'll look at what's in those transcripts, how they were recorded, why Trump is defending Witkoff, and why all the talk of progress towards peace hides a somewhat brutal truth. That is that Vladimir Putin isn't negotiating a just peace. He's negotiating how much of Ukraine he gets to keep and how much of the West's self-respect he can strip away in the process. For those focusing on land and legalities, we are missing the key points that for the Ukrainian side, any deal needs to achieve some level of justice and contrition from the aggressor. And on the Russian side, it will not be counted as a victory. It will not be acceptable to Putin unless Ukraine is demonstrably humiliated. Those are two desires, quite apart from any moral judgments we place on them, that would seem to be completely incompatible. So what has the Witkoff leak shown us? On November 25th, Bloomberg published transcripts of 2 October phone calls involving Yuri Ushakov, a top foreign policy aide to Vladimir Putin, one with Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, the other with Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's economic fixer and longtime back channel to Western elites. Well, that's from Medusa. The Kiev Independent and others quickly unpacked the Ukrainian angle. In the Witkoff-Ushakov call, the envoy is heard promising he can deliver something like Donetsk and maybe a land swap territory if Trump can be persuaded this is the price of getting the deal done. That's in the Kiev Independent. You don't need me to point out how grotesque this is. Wickoff negotiating away the property, the lives, the futures of potentially millions of people, territories which he almost certainly can't place on a map or even remember and pronounce the names of. It is grotesque in the extreme. In other words, the American envoy is heard calmly discussing how much of Ukraine to carve off with Putin's aid before Ukraine is even in the room. And of course, it's a moot point as to whether Ukraine and Russia will ever consent to be in the same room for a genuine negotiation process, that is, in the same room together. The transcripts also show that Witkoff offering coaching on how Putin should handle Trump. He tells Ushakov that Trump responds best to flattery and clear wins he can mark it as his personal triumph. That's advice that sounds less like diplomacy and more like a business coaching session. Meanwhile, the second transcript, Ushakov's call with Kirill Dmitriev, paints an even bleaker picture. According to Meduza's summary of the Bloomberg leaks, Dmitriev pushes for a maximalist Russian list, territorial recognition of all current Russian-occupied areas, limits on Ukraine's military, guarantees against NATO and sanctions relief. That's in Meduza, because of course he does. We would not expect Russia to do anything less according to the Kremlin rules idea, that is that they will always go for the maximalist demands on the principle that if they get anything slightly less than the maximalist demands, they've got far more than the other side would have wanted to give away in the first place. The key point, this isn't some neutral American framework with compromises on both sides. At its core, the 28-point draft plan is heavily built from a Russian wish list, assembled in the presence and with the assistance of a Kremlin envoy, and then shopped to Trump by a loyal fixer. Loyal, that is, to two masters, if that's possible. One who lacks a clear understanding of Ukraine's position, and what's worse, an absolute indifference to it. Well, that's how the Kiev Independent sources put it. They were a little more polite than I was. And Ukrainians, they find out about this peace plan over the telephone. Axios reporting relayed by Ukrainian outlets says Zelensky himself listened on speakerphone as Witkoff and Jared Kushner literally read the 28 points to him line by line during a meeting with Ukrainian security chief Rustam Umerov in Miami. One can only imagine the horror as these 28 points unfolded. And let's be clear, this is not negotiation. It is a demand for surrender and capitulation, dictated to the victim, not the aggressor, and where the victim is not really expected to participate or object. Of course, they have, with European assistance, they have raised objections. So who recorded the calls and why there may be more of them? Who hit record? And why are we hearing these calls at all? Meduza walks through the reaction in Moscow and Washington's information ecosystems. One of the most telling comments comes from Wall Street Journal correspondent Yaroslav Trofimov, who's been on the channel, I should note, absolutely fantastic journalist, Ukrainian. He notes that dozens of countries have the capacity to intercept this kind of conversation on unencrypted cell phones. And whoever has these tapes, well, he concludes, they must have much, much more. That was again in Meduza. So this could get really spicy really quickly. Investigative journalist Christo Groziev is even blunter. Dmitriev, he says, conducted a highly classified discussion on a regular GSM line, the exact sort of amateurism that's fueled a decade of open source investigations into Kremlin operations. And what's more than that, Kirill Dmitriev seems to have messaged Wickoff using a messaging platform or app that's deemed illegal by law in the Russian Federation. Ushakov himself, in an interview with Kommersant, doesn't deny the content of the call. Instead, he complains that some conversations happen via secure lines, where leaks almost never happen, and others via apps like WhatsApp, which someone can apparently find a way to listen in on. That is extraordinarily amateur, and he insists it's hard to imagine the leak came from anyone on the call. Well, that's as may be, but it seems to show he has no real awareness of operational security. Reuters reports that Russian officials calling the leak unacceptable, an act of hybrid warfare and an attempt to sabotage peace efforts. That's in Reuters. Ironically, this is also a line being spread almost word for word by Marco Rubio and many in right-wing media echo chambers. So who benefits from the leak? Medusa highlights a key point. The transcripts give ammunition to critics who argue that the 28-point plan is essentially a capitulation to Russia and that Ukraine and Europe were being cut out of the room. Well, that's particularly, dare I say it, Russian positioning of this, even though it comes from a Russian, supposedly independent opposition media outlet. We need to point out to Medusa that these are not just communications manipulations, no, Medusa, because the 28 points are clearly weighted towards Russian interests, not those of Ukraine. We must not lose sight of the core iniquity that is contained within that 28-point original proposed agreement. So who loses? Well, Witkoff, obviously, but also Dmitriev, who's carefully built an image as a smooth sanctions evader and Trump whisperer. And he now looks dangerously clownish, the guy who's dumb enough to negotiate annexations on an insecure line. Well, that's the view also of the Kiev Independent. This is becoming a Kremlin farce, a Washington-Moscow co-production of the film Dumb and Dumber. Trump also defends Wickoff, and Washington erupts in response. You'd think that when your envoy is caught apparently coaching a Kremlin official on how to sell territorial concessions to you, you might pause and review your personal choices. Not, of course, in this White House. Asked about the leak, Trump's response, quoted by Medusa from remarks picked up by Politico, is visibly shrugging his shoulders. That's a standard thing, he says. Wickoff's got to sell this to Ukraine. He's got to sell Ukraine to Russia. That's what a deal maker does. Quoted from Medusa, this is perhaps a slip of the tongue here because it's clear that Wickoff is not a great deal maker, but he also uses that phrase, sell Ukraine to Russia. Well, what a lousy salesman. He's trying to give it away for nothing. The Guardian details the backlash on Capitol Hill. Republican Congressman Don Bacon and Democrat Ted Lieu both call for Wickoff's dismissal, with Lieu labelling him an actual traitor. That's in The Guardian. Others warn this is exactly how you destroy US credibility with allies. We've seen a lot of that by letting a private fixer freelance grand strategy with Putin's court. And it's hard to disagree with that point of view. But the final question we're going to pose here, and pick this up in the next episode, but might Putin also not be exactly delighted with his envoy, Dmitriev? Might Kirill Dmitriev be in more trouble with his boss than Wickoff is with his, because of the clownishness, because of the amateur way this peace campaign has been executed? And we know that the tolerance of the Kremlin for failure, certainly, but especially humiliation, is not exactly light. Bad things happen to those who let down the Tsar.